Okay, week 2, the Sabbath. Shabbat Shalom. Well, that's not tonight, but that's where we're going to go. A quick kind of review. Last week we talked about the calendar. We talked about a lot of holidays, but I said for the rest of our time together, we're going to zero in on just the particular appointed festivals of the Lord mentioned in Leviticus 23. They're talked about elsewhere. So when we get to them, we'll see them elsewhere. It's not just we're only going to look at Leviticus 23, but Leviticus 23 is going to inform what we're going to do, because the purpose that we're ultimately trying to accomplish isn't so much to learn and have a better familiarity with these Jewish holidays as it is to see in them hints or parallels or prophetic pictures of Jesus as Messiah. So that's where we're going. That's the reason we're doing this. So the Leviticus 23 is kind of our informative text. Now, for those who weren't here last week, we talked about 8 of these appointed feasts. To use this, these are my appointed festivals, the appointed festival of the Lord, the sacred assemblies. There are 8 of them that we're going to talk about over the next course of weeks. In order, they are the Sabbath, Passover, and these ones below them are the Hebrew kind of transliterations. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of First Fruits. Clicker's easier. The Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles. And so when we looked at those last week, we put them on a calendar. We went through the months of the Hebrew year. And what's particularly interesting is the first 3 are basically over 10 or 12 days. And the last 3 are basically over a few weeks as well. So of the 8 ones that are listed, Sabbath isn't on the map or on the calendar because it's everywhere. But the 7 other festivals, mostly the spring and the fall feast of Israel. Thought it was fascinating to consider their calendar, and if you weren't here, the video from that is on our YouTube channel, so you can watch it and learn about solar versus lunar year and all the different permutations of the calendar. So this is where we're going. This is what we're going to talk about. Hopefully, we'll have some fun along the way. The first of the 8 that we're going to talk about is the Sabbath. So right after the introduction, it goes right into the Sabbath. If you have Leviticus 23, if you look at it in the Bible, you'll probably notice most modern translations mark the different paragraphs. So right after saying these are the appointed festivals, it says there are 6 days when you may work, but the 7th day is a day of Sabbath rest, a day of sacred assembly. You are not to do any work wherever you live. It is a Sabbath to the Lord. So this is one verse in Leviticus 23 that sums up that particular instruction on the Sabbath. We don't get a lot here. Now, the ironic part is if you were to talk to a devout Jewish person, out of this one verse has developed observances of the Sabbath that literally fill volumes of works. Because what has happened over the years is out of the Torah comes the initial instruction, and then throughout the history of Israel, rabbis have tried to take verses like this, and we'll look at a few others in the Torah, and parse them out to say, what does it mean that you are not to do any work? Of all of this, most of the focus is on this phrase right here. You are not to do any work. As if the entirety of the Sabbath revolved around not working. Now, that's a pretty important thing. It's in the commandment. But somehow what has happened, and this is a critique that often happens in most religious practices, is we look at this and we miss all of this. Because this is pretty important. It says you work for 6 days, but it's a day of Sabbath rest, a day of sacred assembly. Those seem like big ideas that are there. I remember when I was in college, I did an internship in Miami, And there were two of us that did the internship, and we stayed with the pastor of the church. He was my youth minister growing up, who was starting a church in the Kendall area, back when Town and Country Mall was the end of civilization. And he was in West Kendall, and there was this golf course out there. There was nothing else but this little development. Anyway, and we were there for the internship, and it was Sunday after church, and I was walking through the house with my laundry basket because I needed to do some laundry. And the other intern was aghast, shocked, appalled that a good Christian would do their laundry on the Sabbath. Now, did any of you grow up around those kind of very strict observances?
Not in my family, but people that did come here.
People that came here.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Anything in particular jump out at you? I'm just curious. Anything you remember like, oh, that was weird?
Well, we had a pastor, and they had, so there were a bunch of us kids the same age, and we would go swimming on a Sunday. That was not allowed.
That was not allowed.
Swimming wasn't. No, you had to go home from church and sit and be very still and quiet and reflect.
Now, again, these are Christian observances of an Old Testament law. Anybody else have a story? Anybody else?
My dad hardly ever went to church, but he believed. And the one thing he did, he was a farmer. And it wouldn't matter how bad the weather was all week long. Sunday. He didn't go out and do and play with his kids. Sunday.
So he wasn't a religious person necessarily.
Not real strong religion, especially going to church.
That was important.
But he didn't.
Somebody else have a
Now, the Jewish observance is Sabbath.
right.
Yes, that's Saturday.
So I remember when I was growing up here, I had a lot of friends who were Jewish, and Saturday, and I was raised Methodist, so Sundays were church. So, okay, I just wanted to see.
Wait, were they called blue laws?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Exactly.
Which were ones that limited what you could, like you couldn't buy or sell alcohol.
South Carolina was closed.
When I was a kid, it was a big deal when Publix started opening on Sunday.
Right.
Yeah.
I remember, like, the good church folks were going to refuse to go to that pagan store. But my mom being one of them, until we needed something on Sunday. And then it became convenient because it was just down the street from the church. So it was really easy to pop in there. But even then, they had these covers over alcohol.
Yeah.
Couldn't get any of that until, I don't know if you can not do it at all or just later in the day.
Depends on the state.
Depends on the state. By the way, I don't know if you got the practice. It looks like there's no practice tonight because of the traffic and the fires.
Okay, yeah,
I
thank
don't
you.
know if you're on the email chain with
I
Maria.
probably am, but I hadn't seen it.
Hey, everyone. Let me just read it. Let me know if you're available any other day to rehearse. So that's it.
Okay.
So you don't have to leave.
Okay, good.
Anyway, back to the Sabbath. So even in Christian circles, there was a lot of emphasis on this. I remember the other thing I remember is we would not, one of our pastors made it a point that he would tell us, I don't want you going out to lunch. I don't want you going out to the restaurant
Oh, really?
on the Sabbath, because you're forcing those other people to break it. And if you have that principle, you should give them that principle too. We did not shut down the restaurants on Sunday.
I was going to say.
Nobody seemed to mind that the Baptists weren't coming, probably because Christians historically have been known as the worst tippers. So anyway, that's another story. For another. There are web pages of waitstaff that will share pictures of Christian tips they get after church on Sunday. A lot of waitstaff do not, it has nothing to do with the Sabbath, but will not want to work on a Sunday because of the post-church crowd lunch anyway. So don't be like that is what I'm saying.
It was interesting to be in a Hasidic neighborhood.
Oh, yes. How so?
The horn sounds 30 minutes before sundown. And it sounds the second time at sundown, everybody's gone. They're off the streets.
Okay, I'm gonna take this home.
And so it's just, and they also can't turn on lights, everything, they got everything set up, or they have to ask for help, which I thought was interesting. You
So-
really thought, yeah.
Some versions of Judaism, you can't ask specifically for help. You have to hint enough, hoping that someone will get the hint. But I could, if I was in a strict, I don't know if it was Hasidic or whatever, there's certain branches, I couldn't say, hey, would you mind turning on the light? Because I'm not allowed to turn on the light on the Sabbath. I have to say, boy, it sure is dark in here. And hope somebody gets the hint that I wish you would turn on the light. So,
And then give them a dollar.
oh yeah, of course. Why not? So this is huge. We talk about Sabbath. One of my goals tonight, in addition to connecting the Sabbath to Jesus, is to help us see it differently. And not to take such a legalistic view of what the Sabbath is, because I think, this is my thesis a little bit, Sabbath is meant to be a gift to God's people, not a burden. And one of the things Jesus says, sorry, turn that off. Niece is going to text, but I think she's on here, so she can just yell at me. Anyway, I forgot what I was saying.
Sabbath is a gift.
Sabbath is a gift. It's not meant to be a burden. Yes, I'll just leave it at that. I had a whole train of thought, but I lost it. So let's jump in. Okay. So this is the Hebrew word for Sabbath, SHBTH. So Shabbat is how you would typically hear it pronounced. We kind of anglicize it to Sabbath. It literally means ceasing or resting. So let's back up to this. And what we have here is there are 6 days you may work, but the seventh day is a day of Sabbath rest. This word is Shabbat. This word is a form of Shabbat. Oh, did I write it down? Please tell me I wrote it down, because it just slipped my mind. Shucks. So this basically, I forget the full form of it. This basically, it's a day of Sabbath here. And this is whenever, we do this in English too. Whenever you repeat a word twice, you're doing it for emphasis. In Hebrew, if you repeat it 3 times, you're really emphasizing it, i.e. God is holy, holy, holy. It's not just they can't think of another word to say. It's meant for extreme emphasis. But here, the seventh day is a Sabbath. It's an intensive form of this. So there are only 2 times really that this kind of double, this repetition thing shows up on the Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath, and the Sabbath that's connected to the Day of Atonement is also a Sabbath. But even other Sabbaths around the Jewish holidays are just Sabbaths, one Sabbath. But this word is kind of our word, Shabbat. We know that. It shows up for the first time in the Bible. Would anybody want to guess?
What are you going to say, Genesis?
Genesis.
You are correct. Genesis chapter 2. By the 7th day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day, this is the word, Shabbat. Obviously not translated Sabbath, just translated rested or ceased from all his work. Then God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. So there it is again, rested. So the first time that word shows up in the Hebrew scriptures is in Genesis around the creation account. Now, if you notice, again, it's not translated Sabbath. When we get to the commandments in just a few minutes, you'll see a connection between the Genesis account and the observance of Sabbath. But it shows you this is just what the word means. Rest. Okay, I can't do any more. I'm just exhausted. I need to put my feet up. That's me. at the end of the day, not God. But it's a principle. Now, there's another very fascinating thing that happens. When you think about the Genesis 1 into Genesis 2, the 7-day account of creation, later in Genesis 2 is kind of a different way of describing creation, that 7-day account. When you think about it, it has a pattern and a rhythm to it, doesn't it? God sees something, God says something, it happens, and then he says it's good. And after proclaiming it good, there's this repetitive pattern. There was evening and there was morning the first day. It was evening, there was morning the second day, so on and so forth. So when we talk about Sabbath, we talk about the Hebrew view of time, we talked about all those holidays, we said they begin at sundown on Friday, even though the day we call it is the seventh day. In the Hebrew mind, the day begins at sundown. So Wednesday's about over, Thursday is coming in just an hour or two when the sun goes down. That's the connection there. But what is also noteworthy is when we get to the seventh day, what do we not see? It doesn't say there was evening, there was morning, seventh day. Just tells us this, that God blessed the seventh day, made it holy, because he rested from all the work that he had done. And then the very next verse says, this is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created, when the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. And it's the story of Adam and Eve naming the animals and all of that. Now, maybe we just gloss over that. But that seems to me would have been in an oral culture, and really in any culture, as we read things, as we notice patterns, when there's a change to the pattern, we should go, well, that's important. Why is there no evening and morning the seventh day? And one of the implications that some theologians draw from that is that the Sabbath, this day of rest, is meant to define what is from there on out to happen. That God has created in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested. And there's no evening and morning, and we go back to day one. But God leaves it open. And the Eden narrative is the picture of the Sabbath. Is the picture of this Sabbath rest, as we would call it, that isn't meant to end, but is the picture of God's perfect communion with humanity, mankind's dominion over the created order, this garden that is the symbol that shows up again where? In the end of the book, in Revelation. And that imagery, when we get there, is much like the imagery of Eden, to say what God created in the beginning, he restores at the end, and this time there is no end. That we don't have to worry about. We can't mess that up. He's going to set it right, and we're going to get to enjoy it. So that little literary clue in the creation narrative hopefully sets us up to think, okay, so maybe there's more going on with the Sabbath than just, oh, it's the day we're supposed to go to church. No, from the created order, and this is what's appealed to in the commandments, God is not just by his example resting and telling us to rest, but instituting his perfect rule that is meant to last over humanity. Now we know in chapter 3, all that gets undermined. Humanity sins, and we are cast out of the garden, the Sabbath rest of God that existed from day 7 until day sin is over. And out of that, when God now begins to institute his plan to redeem humanity, and even in Genesis 3:15 gives the first hint that I'm going to do something. I'm going to send the Messiah. You will bruise your heel, but you will crush his head. That first hint, the seed of the woman, will ultimately bring victory. The rest of the story of Scripture, leading up to that ending in Revelation, is God trying to restore what we have ruined. And as part of the created order in the Torah, in the law he gives, as part of it, he puts this thing we call the Sabbath. So the next question is, if this is the first time the word Shabbat shows up, where is the first time Sabbath shows up? Not a trick question. I'm going to tell you it's not. So it's rhetorical. That's the word I'm looking for. Well, it's in Exodus, but it's not with the commandments. It's in Exodus 16. Exodus 15 is the Song of Miriam after they are delivered. Exodus 16, they're in the wilderness. And we have this whole business with manna. God's going to provide for them this miraculous bread, this food that will feed them. And it tells us in Exodus 16:3, right? He said to them, this is what the Lord commanded, Moses speaking. Tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath rest. Here's the double, Sabbath. Tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil, save whatever is left and keep it until morning. It even goes on and says, it's not going to spoil, it's going to last. So part of what happens is God gives instructions to the people in the wilderness. He says, here's what I want you to do. This manna is going to be there. I want you to collect enough for one day, just for the day. Go out and get what you want. We talked about this even in church recently. And when you do that, don't worry, because the next morning there'll be more. Some people think, I'm not so sure there's going to be more, so they get more than a day's worth, and the extra rots and is full of maggots. I think it says this stinks and it's full of maggots. So I have to throw it out. Until day 6. And he says on the 6th day, gather enough for 2 days. And the reason you're to do it is because tomorrow is a day of Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath from the Lord. So bake, boil, save, keep whatever is left in the morning. So this is the first time Israel is introduced to this concept of Sabbath rest. Now, a couple chapters later, Exodus 20, it's one of the commandments. So it'll be kind of codified for them. But this is it. And it is significant because it's right on the heels of their deliverance from slavery. And what is one thing you don't get when you're a slave? A day off, right? When you're a slave, when the master says work, you work. And we know in the story of the Exodus, the Pharaoh, as they grow in size and influence, he continues to put burdens on them. He ups their quota and takes away their straw, so they have to work for the straw to make even more brick than they did before. He makes it really hard on them. So they've lived this life for 400 or so years from the time Joseph brings the family to Egypt, where they're subject for a lot of that time to the Egyptian masters, and they're used to just working. That's their entire life, work. And one of the first things God does isn't just give them miraculous bread that they can eat, so they don't have to plow the fields, they don't have to plant, it's just there. But he also says, hey, I've built into this rest. This is revolutionary for people whose whole life revolves around work. By the way, it's revolutionary in the 21st century for a culture whose whole mantra is work, is try to get ahead, is, to slow down somehow is problematic, and somebody else is going to pass you. So you can't let off it's just this idea. Some of you have probably been in the corporate world. You've experienced that exact kind of pressure and drive. That's what we value in this world. Burn the midnight oil is a virtue. It's something that's looked up to. And God says to his people, very beginning, look, I'm going to provide for you miraculously. And in that provision, I'm going to provide for you so much you can take a day off. Or you don't have to plant, you don't have to sow, but you don't even have to go out and get it. Just get it, bake it the day before, and it'll be there the next day. That's pretty remarkable. A couple other verses in this same chapter. Verse 23 is there. Let's see, verse 27, I believe. Nevertheless, some of the people went out on the 7th day to gather it, and they found none. And the Lord said to Moses, how long will you refuse to keep my commands and instructions? Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. This is why on the 6th day he gives you bread for 2 days. Everyone is to stay where they are on the 7th day. No one is to go out. So the people rested on the 7th day. Notice that twice in that one verse. He has given you. He's given you. The Sabbath is meant to be a gift to his people. So he gives them bread for 2 days. By the way, if you go to a Jewish Sabbath observance, you will know that on the beginning of the Sabbath, they have 2 loaves of bread. Why? Because of this very passage, 2 days. So each of the challah loaves represent the 2 days of bread that they were to have gathered in the wilderness. So we go from this sort of introduction to the people of God, that there's this new thing, to the commandments. And commandment number 4, I believe, in the list of Exodus 20. Remember the Sabbath day. Okay, so here, you got to remember something that you've already been told. But we would think, I think in my mind, I would have thought, well, the Sabbath happened from the very beginning. People just knew that because of creation. But they didn't. It didn't happen until not too long before this is handed down. So you got to remember it because it's new to you. Don't forget, by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor, do all your work. But the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. There it is. Neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days, and here's the connection to the creation account, the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So there you go. One of the interesting things here is, again, this idea of work. This is interesting. Having been slaves, they're told who can't work. If you have slaves, they get the day off too. Your animals get the day off. Even the foreigner resting in your towns. The Sabbath is instituted by God, the Sabbath observance for Israel. And then what Israel does is has to parse it out. They have to decide what you can and cannot do. And so we kind of mentioned this earlier. There are literally volumes, Talmud, Mishnah, and such, of rabbis talking back and forth through the ages of what this means. Some fascinating stuff. My favorite, I've used this example before, but it shows how pedantic they were. There's a rabbinic record that records, if on the Sabbath you spit and it lands on the grass, that is okay, you have not worked. However, if it lands in the dirt, you have made mud, which is work, and you have broken the Sabbath. How about that? I mean, and there are volumes of this kind of thing. Now, some of it's practical because there is an Exodus, I think, 35, don't make a fire, specifically Exodus 35:3. So what does that mean in our modern society? What does that mean? It means if you're an observant Jew of the Sabbath, you don't turn on a light switch because you don't do anything, you don't start or stop anything electrical because that has to do with currents. And there's a fire behind that. I guess the engineer might fill us in with a few more details on how that exactly works. But nonetheless, you're not. There are specific rules about how far you can walk. So you were in the Hasidic community. Did you notice any wires around on the Sabbath? Any lines put around on the Sabbath?
I didn't see it.
So
They may be there.
They may be, and they try to make them not obvious.
Yeah.
Reading about it, they say, people object. They're like, why? It's there.
But now this would be for every person. So mine would be different from yours, right?
What's that?
The limit.
What the rule was, you can't carry anything. And it became defined by you can't carry anything from your private place into a public area. So inside your home, you could carry stuff. Inside your private area, kind of is how they defined it. And so the rabbis allowed for these communities to make a boundary around several homes, and modern strict Jewish neighborhoods will literally, it might be there all the time for all I know, but they have a wire or a rope that defines, that becomes their public area. And I'm assuming their private area. The whole community, not just your inner house, the whole community becomes your private area. So you're able to carry on and carry things literally around that area. So I think it's called an eruv. E-R-U-V is how I pronounce it. They might pronounce it a little differently. This is an accommodation they made to allow them to not break the Sabbath law of carrying something. All of this builds up in their history, and even as we've discussed in our Christian history, around what does it mean to not work on the Sabbath.
The Hasidics have a different way of doing it.
How is that?
The only place they go on the Sabbath is synagogue.
Yes.
So they don't have to worry about carrying anything because they don't go.
You can't even carry your keys.
Yeah.
So if you have to lock your house and have keys in your pocket, that's carrying something. Very.
Yeah.
So if what happens is they put the synagogue, you can't drive your car because that'd be starting a fire. So you got to walk.
They walk.
So they broke off the area in the community. That's why most of these very strict communities are together. You don't have the Hasidic Jew here and 4 blocks later the next Hasidic Jew. They're all right there together because that can become their agreement, their private compound, and so they can get away. And I know that's not the right way to put it, but yeah, they can walk, they can carry stuff, they can do some things. Feel they haven't broken the Sabbath.
When I've been in Miami Beach and that area on
Right.
on a Saturday, you will see a lot of Jewish people as a group walking together to church and back.
I've seen that when we were in West Palm in college, in Palm Beach, and in Miami Beach. We were up there for a play or something.
Yeah,
They went up early
yeah.
on a Saturday. They were, that was the thing. You knew when you were in the Jewish area. It's very strict. And by the way, that's not every Jew. The continuum of Judaism has such that the more modern reform would, I'll do whatever I want on Sabbath off. But nonetheless, that's it. So, yes.
How many all these rules, hearing all of these rules, how we can justify and accept, and because we're not doing any, we drive every day, Saturday to Sunday to church.
Right.
And then, all the rules, how, but at the same time, what I understood is Saturday evening, Friday evening to Saturday evening, so maybe church became worshiping God. That's how it became our pattern, starting, I don't know how long way back.
You mean to move it to Sunday?
Huh?
You mean that's why we worship on Sunday, or?
Yeah, some of them Saturday.
Right.
That's what I thinking myself. And but you're talking about electricity, the car turning key, and we're doing all these. I mean, there's a million things that we become totally out of what God is demanding or rule gave us.
Well, that's the point. These rules that they made aren't in the Bible. They made them up to help them understand. For instance, you can't start your car because it does say don't start a fire, and to start a combustion engine with the spark plug and the gasoline, there's a bunch of fires you're starting.
But you just put it on the Genesis 2:16. Yeah, the rules, God is, so that was in the Bible.
Right. So the principle of Sabbath is in the Bible. But all of these particular rules grow up out of religious leaders making traditions of how to interpret what the Bible means. The second thing for us as Christians is we're no longer bound by the Old Testament law, that we're not subject to the law. We're no longer under law, we're under grace. Now, that doesn't mean I can go out and murder somebody because, the law says that, obviously, it's not that ridiculous. But as it applies to the Sabbath, when we make the transition to Jesus, I think you'll see what we're going to try to say, why we don't have to be so strict and legalistic about these things. And that's kind of where we started, that the tradition, even in the Christian world, was to grab the prohibitions that grew up around some of these Old Testament laws and bring them forward and say, okay, we're going to just do this on Sunday instead of Saturday. I don't think that's the proper interpretation of what we are to do. We did that one. Last one. Exodus 35.
wait, one behind. Yeah, there's a Sabbath day and made it holy.
Right.
That holy means how to explain whole thing. That I don't get to.
So holy means to set apart, to be other. So the reason the Sabbath day was considered holy is because it was different than all the other days. You treated the Sabbath differently, is what that idea is. God is holy because there's nothing else like him. He is unique. We think holy and we think perfect, and God is perfect. He is sinless and all that. But holy at its root just means you've never seen anything like this. So let's go forward a little bit.
Okay.
Last Old Testament passage, Exodus 35, another one. This is how seriously they took it. Whoever does any work is to be put to death. And you can find in the Old Testament places where people are stoned for working on the Sabbath. So this is just kind of, they took this seriously. So I can see why if I break the Sabbath, they're going to throw rocks at me until I'm dead. I would want to make sure that if that's the line, I'm going to stay over here. I don't even want to mess with it. I don't want to have any problems that would lead to my death, right? Now, when we get to the New Testament, oh, wait, last thing. This table you can find lots of places. It looks like the periodic table. It's not. There's only 39 elements in this one. These are the 39, this is the Hebrew word for work, the melekot table. These are the 39 categories of work you cannot do. Plowing, sowing, reaping, gathering, threshing, winnowing, sorting, grinding, sifting, kneading, baking, shearing, whitening, disentangling, dyeing, spinning, mounting warp, preparing to weave, weaving, separating threads, tying a knot, untying a knot, cutting, sewing, tearing, trapping, slaughtering, skinning, salting, smoothing, tracing lines, building, demolishing, striking the final blow, carrying, writing 2 letters, erasing 2 letters, kindling, or extinguishing.
Milking's not on that list.
Is it not?
You have to milk a cow every day.
There you go. I guess they
That
were.
was one of my big things with my grandfather. How did he do that?
What did he say?
He wasn't
Make the top 39.
Yeah. But he wasn't Jewish.
When did this election,
This is from
when was it established?
the modern Jewish Chabad.org is the website
Okay.
that I think I pulled this one off of. There are a bunch of them. There's different theories about where it comes from. One of them is that these are some of the tasks that were part of the building of the tabernacle. Since the tabernacle is holy, anything that would resemble that building of the tabernacle is abstained from on the Sabbath. Another theory is, I wrote it down.
But it's some other stuff too, because they're not shearing. Shearing was on there too, right?
Shearing was on there, I believe.
But not much shearing going on this time.
I know I wrote it down. It's probably way back here. These are the other theories. These are the things Adam had to do to survive after the fall. So they represent post-fall, post-Eden behaviors. And in the Sabbath, we go back to the garden. That idea. So there are a couple of theories about where they come from. They're relatively standard. I don't know when they got kind of standardized. As you heard me read them off, some of them for a lot of us, I have no problem not plowing on the Sabbath. Right now, in my life, there's not a lot of plowing that ever happens, much less on the Sabbath. I haven't sheared a sheep in my life, so I'm good. So obviously, you can see that this is a very agricultural basis, as Israel would have been. But
It's interesting because it reminds me of also in the Genesis story, the curse after the fall. this was what he had to do. You will now toil the ground. You will
Right.
have to prepare your own food and work the land and that sort of thing. And so in that context, then Sabbath is actually a suspension of the curse. If you can't.
Yeah. That's what we do. If Sabbath doesn't have a day, the evening and morning, and if it's the picture of what we believe as Christians in the end, yeah, Sabbath for us is a foretaste of eternity. And for Israel was a reminder of what they had. Now, I don't know if I'm going to make it to Jesus tonight. Is that better?
Yeah, it's,
Because for Israel, they expanded, the Torah, I should say, expands the Sabbath beyond the day. And they had a second layer, there's a Sabbath year. So the seventh year becomes a Sabbath year. And in that year, lots of things happen. You don't do any planting. You leave the ground unplanted. You have to trust. In the wilderness, you had to trust God would give you enough bread for 2 days. When they get into the land and when they get settled, you have to trust God will give you enough bread for 2 years. And it says that how would we live? We will multiply your harvest in the 6th year so that you can get that 7th year off. There was release of debt. There was return of slaves. There was, by the way, also in the field thing, it says in the law, you don't plant your fields, you don't sow your fields. That way, the poor will have something to eat. And so, if you've ever farmed, sometimes stuff grows. Don't plant. It's leftover seed that fell off last year's crop or whatever it grows. That was for the poor, for the widow, for the foreigner. It was fair game. You weren't supposed to touch it. You had enough from last year. And then that's expanded again to a Jubilee year, a 7 sevens. And the 50th year is a major year. I think it's Leviticus 25, if I'm not mistaken. We talked about it a few weeks ago when we talked about something in the Sermon on the Mount. Yep, the Sabbath year, the year of Jubilee, both of those are listed in there, and they become these key things. Now, interestingly enough, there are some Jewish historians that wonder if the Jews ever truly honored the Jubilee year. In fact, Rabbi Hillel, who was very famous pre-Jesus, made a law because what was happening was Jews were refusing to lend money in the 6th year because they knew the debt would be forgiven in the 7th. Sometimes, and part of the calculation is if somebody's gonna come and be your slave, for instance, you kind of calculate how many years it is till the next Jubilee or Sabbath year, and you Jubilee year, I think, for that factor accordingly. Money is every 7 years, and so they would just stop lending because they knew they were going to lose. And Rabbi Hillel makes a law or a declaration that individuals on the 7th year can't collect debts, but banks are free to. So as long as you run the debt through the bank, you can get your money back, which is really kind of a bad workaround. But he was trying to, I guess in his mind, we have people that needed money lent, and people weren't lending money, and it was causing problems. So he was trying to. So
well, they wanted business to continue. So business to business. And by that time in history.
Well, really, the looking out was for the poorer of the people. Yeah. The wealthy didn't want to lend; they had the money. The poor needed help, but they couldn't get it because. So he's trying to work around to help the least fortunate in the scenario. So anyway, it's an interesting thing, but you have kind of this layer upon layer upon layer of Sabbath law that is meant to be for Israel a picture. In fact, the Sabbath itself came to represent the entirety of the covenant. It became a symbol of the entire covenant God made with Israel, which is why when we go back to that verse, they're going to stone you or they're going to kill you if you break it. To break the Sabbath is in effect to break God's entire covenant with Israel. These pictures that represent more than just the issue itself. It represents God's entire relationship with Israel. And so he took it seriously. So they wanted to take it seriously, but also at the same time, they didn't want to take it too seriously, at least if they were on the well-to-do side, because some began to see the Sabbath as a way for others to take advantage of them. So it transferred from, here is this thing that God has given us that's a sign and a seal of his covenant, that we are his people and we represent him on this world, hoping that other people, other nations will come to know our God by the way we conduct ourselves and by the way we represent him, to how can we, who was it? Was it Winston Churchill? Is that the old saying that when he was on his deathbed, he was reading the Bible and they asked him why, and he said, I'm looking for loopholes. It becomes a lot of that. Like, how can we find the workaround here well, isn't that what Jesus is talking about in the Sermon on the Mount? You got the externals. You're not murdering anybody. But when I scratch below the surface, the heart is different. And that is evident in the history of Israel. Even from a rabbi, a famous, still to this day revered rabbi, Hillel of Israel, trying to, maybe in his mind, help those who need it, but also, what's the loophole here? What's the workaround so that we don't have to strictly observe the Sabbath? So all of this gets pushed together in some weird permutation.
That's what this table reminds me of.
What's that?
First thing I thought of was how many they'll be looking for loopholes.
There you go. Why is the loophole? How can we, it's not a biblical principle. We came up with
really
a
good at it, yeah.
So, and don't we do that? I mean, don't I do that sometimes?
Maybe that's why a lot of lawyers are Jewish. Excuse me, I had.
That's one way to look at it. And it's into that culture, that kind of religious arena, that Jesus comes. And so he steps into all of that. And he's got a whole entire population of Jewish people that for years have been instructed by the religious leaders. And we're just talking about one thing around the Sabbath, that is this onus for them, with the threat of death if you don't toe the line, or at least toe the loophole. And he comes into that and he says in Matthew 11, these words, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you" what? Rest.
Yes.
That word is not Sabbath. We're in a different language, but the idea is the same. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find, there it is again, rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So in this passage where he's talking to people, he makes this claim. Now, the image he uses is interesting. Take my yoke upon you. We grew up, my dad's grandfather, who was, I considered him my grandfather. I didn't know till much later he was actually my great-grandfather, because he raised my father after his dad died and his mom left. Was a farmer in Virginia. And he had, all the trappings of farming. Loved to go to his place. It was a place in the mountains, Damascus, Bristol. Went by just a couple years ago, drove by, finally found the address and drove by the home place that we used to visit. Man, I can't believe, I really wish our family could have kept that in the family, but you know what happens when somebody dies and they fight over their money. Unfortunately, that's what happened there. Anyway, but he had in his barn yoke, because he had different animals they had to put them on. Those things don't look, the words I would not use are easy and light.
Gentle.
And gentle. No, I mean, they're meant to take beasts with strength and to harness them and to drive them and to take their strength and put it to use for you. But it's also an idiom in Jesus's day. And the word yoke became associated with rabbis. And the rabbi's yoke was their interpretation, their teaching of how to put into practice the Old Testament Torah, the law. And Jesus comes into a place where most of the religious teaching, most of the yokes that people had put on them are heavy and burdensome. And Jesus says, take my yoke. So I want you to understand from my point of view, the law, the Torah. And when you do that, notice what he promises them is rest. I think that's significant because if Sabbath began to be associated as the key symbol of the entire covenant, for Jesus to come along, he says, when you follow me, when you take my way of understanding and living out the law of God, the result will be rest. Rest for your souls. The result will be Sabbath. This is what I've come to bring you. And so, for us, this is a pretty familiar verse if you've been around church for a while. And it's one that we unfortunately, I think that old phrase familiarity, I don't know if it breeds contempt in the sense that, I hate this verse, as much as it breeds me just kind of glossing over something sometimes. Just, yeah, I've heard that before. And so I have these things. But in the context of Sabbath, that word rest really jumps out at me because that's what he promises. What does Jesus bring? We say eternal life, salvation. Jesus uses this word. I will give you rest. Does he talk about life and salvation, forgiveness? Sure, that's important. But doesn't rest embody all of that too? Wasn't life in the Garden of Eden all of that? It was eternal till sin came along, right? And it was easy and it was delight. The work that they did wasn't a burden like it was after the fall. So Jesus is coming into town. He's coming in and teaching and performing miracles. And his promise is rest.
Is this in the other Gospels? Is this phrase?
I don't know. That's a good question.
The reason I'm saying that was Matthew was written primarily for Jews.
Right.
And they would have taken this maybe differently than.
Very true. It's a good point.
Yeah, especially about the yoke, because they wouldn't know what the rabbis did, but Gentiles.
Right. They would be like, why would I want to put an ox's yoke on?
Yeah.
Nobody sounds good, but yeah, that's a good point. You could be right. Could be.
I'm just curious.
I don't know off the top of my head if it's one of those that was repeated elsewhere. And sometimes the repetition elsewhere is close, but not exactly.
Yeah.
The wording is a little different. But that's a great point, and you could very well be on this. So this will be the end of tonight and the introduction to next week. We're going to look at chapter 12. If you want to read ahead, look at what the conversation is in chapter 12 right after this. What happens next? What does Jesus talk about? What is the conflict over? And so we're going to look at some of those things, not just in chapter 12, but elsewhere. Okay. Any more thoughts, comments, questions, things to add? I know we haven't finished it. We just introduced the whole point of it. But
I think I understand pretty much myself. You will find rest for your soul. It's all individual to when you have really, truly moment or period of time you wanted to be resting in your soul, then you could be, that's a part of a meaning of that, but not just only Saturday, Sunday.
it's bigger than that.
Yeah,
exactly. It's much
that's
bigger.
what I think I'm going to be understanding. So there's a period of time every day. You could have that too if you focus on that.
Good point.
And I find the description of weary and burdened to be emotional work. Whereas I think a lot of the Malakos table and that whole concept is about physical work.
Right.
But again, Jesus takes it inside, not outside.
Following all those rules would be a lot of work. It'd be great.
Following all those rules would be a lot of work.
Remembering all those rules, following all those rules.
Knowing if somebody's got their stone ready, just go ahead.
But if you're, even if you're in the neighbor, I mean, if you're in the community, people would be,
Yeah.
you know, calling you out for this stuff. Turn you into the rabbi.
There you go.
Not a lot of work. I mean, it's just, you don't have time to do anything. I mean, you could get lost in all this stuff. Jesus.
Yeah. And I wish I could say legalism stopped in the first century, but it's a lot. I was raised in a very legalistic Christian environment. I got a lot from it. I have great gratitude for being raised some of the ways I am, but looking back, I see how some of that overly legalistic view it could also be detrimental. All right. Well, I will pray and we'll come back again next week and dig a little deeper. Father in heaven, we thank you for your great grace to us through your Son, Jesus. Thank you that in him we can truly find rest for our souls. Thank you for his life, the record of it we have in the scriptures. Thank you for the life that he brings to us through faith. Thank you for the privilege of knowing you and growing, hopefully in more Christ-likeness each day, and for being your representatives, your ambassadors in our world, in our community. Lord, may we truly live out the rest that you have promised and provided in Christ in a way that would be a compelling picture of your grace to our friends, our neighbors, our family members who don't know you. And they would be drawn to you through our example and our witness. Thank you that you use us in that way, as imperfect as we are, as often as we stumble and sin. Thank you for that grace that forgives even then. We ask that as we wrap up tonight, as we go to our homes, as we go to whatever the rest of this week holds, that we will go aware of your Spirit's leading in every way and asking for your protection and provision that we might come back together to worship you again as your church, as your body, as this body on Sunday. Praying all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.